Weigh this gold bar and prove it's not tungsten.
You fix vending machines for a living. This should be simple math for a man like you. You brought your own scale.
I brought my grandfather's.
Sentimental. The number will still be the number.
I set the bar on my grandfather's balance, watched the needle settle dead on the mark, then lifted a thin steel rod from the box and tapped the bar once.
The weight is right. It was always going to be right. That was never the part you needed me to get wrong. Then we're finished here. Not yet. Gold answers when you strike it.
This one didn't answer anything at all.
To understand why a sound almost nobody else in that room even registered was about to cost a man 18 years of trust and would bring him close enough to my own son that I still think about how differently it could have gone, you have to start 4 years earlier with a wooden box that sat forgotten on a shelf in the back of my shop. My name is Wes Calloway, 41 years old. I fix vending machines and arcade cabinets for a living, the coin slots and bill validators and claw machines that eat quarters all over Millhaven, the kind of job people forget exists until their soda gets stuck or their kid's favorite game starts spitting tokens back out. Most of what I know, I learned on the job, testing rejected coins against good ones until my hands could tell the difference before my eyes finished looking. A woman at the laundromat on 5th Street called me out last month because her machine kept rejecting a roll of quarters her son had brought back from a trip. I ran 2 of the coins between my fingers before I even looked at them straight on. Lighter than they should have been, the milled edge just slightly too smooth, foreign coins close enough in size to pass a vending slot's rough sensor, but not close enough to fool a hand that had been checking metal since it was 10 years old. She laughed when I told her, said she never would have noticed in 100 years. Most people would not have. That was never really the point of the work. The rest of what I know, my grandfather taught me, and I spent 4 years pretending I had not learned it at all. My son Sawyer is 8. Before he touches anything metal or glass, a doorknob, a fork, the edge of the kitchen table, he taps it twice with one fingernail, quick and light, then goes on with whatever he was doing. He started doing it around the time he turned 6, watching me test parts on the workbench, and when I asked him about it once, he told me, very seriously, that he was checking to see if it was real. I never corrected him. I'm not sure it needed correcting. Renata has been gone 4 years now. The accident happened on a wet road 2 towns over, on a night I have gone over enough times in my head that I have finally stopped trying to change how it ends. What I can say is that the weeks after taught me a strange thing about grief, that it does not always show up as sadness. Sometimes it shows up as a closed box on a shelf, one you keep meaning to open and somehow never quite do. One of those boxes belonged to my grandfather, Silas Calloway, who ran a small assay and coin exchange counter on Miller Street in Millhaven from 1968 until he died in 2005. He had trained for a few years at a regional mint before that, checking blanks and rejecting counterfeit slugs before most machines could do it electronically. And when he opened his own shop, he spent the next 4 decades teaching half the town how to tell real from plated, genuine from clever. The shop itself is a hair salon now, has been for years, though the old brass counter is still bolted to the floor under a row of styling chairs because nobody who bought the building could figure out a clean way to remove it. I walk past it more than I probably need to. Most people in Millhaven who remember Silas Calloway remember him as a quiet, patient man who never once tried to talk anyone into paying more than a thing was actually worth, which, in a business built entirely on telling people whether their treasures were real, was rarer than it should have been. He taught me the same way, on slow afternoons after school, laying 2 coins or 2 rings or 2 scraps of scrap metal on the counter and making me guess which was which before he would tell me anything. Weight first, then the caliper, measuring exact against exact, then, if the first 2 were not enough, the tap. A thin steel rod, struck once, low, and a good ear that had been trained since before I could read. I got it wrong more times than I got it right those first years. He never once told me the answer outright. He would just set the 2 pieces side by side again and tell me to listen harder until one afternoon I was maybe 11. I picked the real $50 out of a pair on the first try, and he did not praise me for it. He only nodded once, the way a man nods when a fact has simply been confirmed, and moved on to the next pair. I understood even then that the nod meant more than praise would have. "A number on a scale can be arranged to fool you," he said once, tapping a coin flat against the counter with 2 fingers. "If it's real, it answers you back." That sentence took me years to actually grow into. As a boy, I just repeated it back to him like any other rule of the shop: weight before caliper, caliper before tap. It was not until I was raising a boy of my own that the word started meaning something closer to what he must have intended all along. He left me the wooden box the week he died, tools inside it older than my father, and I put it on a shelf in the back of my shop and did not open it again until 4 years ago, when my own father passed it along a second time after Renata's funeral, as though he understood I needed something of my grandfather's near me, even if I could not look at it yet. Most nights it is just the 2 of us at the house on Larkspur Road, a routine we built out of necessity that turned, somewhere along the way, into something closer to a small, steady comfort. Sawyer does his homework at the kitchen table while I sort parts for the next day's route, and most evenings end with him reciting some fact he learned that day about dinosaurs or planets, waiting for me to act appropriately amazed, which I always am, whether or not I already knew it. This spring, the Millhaven County Historical Society announced its Founders Gala, a fundraiser built around a matching pledge from the Ashgrove Family Trust, whose money had underwritten half the county's civic buildings since the 1950s. As part of the arrangement, the trust moved its entire private vault collection into the Society's own secured storage room for the length of the pledge exhibition, on loan just long enough to let 1 gold bar be displayed publicly as proof the pledge was real. The Historical Society hired me to service the old ceremonial brass scale they used every year for a charity weigh-in game, the same scale that had sat in a glass case since before I was born. I had no idea that fixing a stuck pan spring on an antique scale was about to put me in the middle of the only fraud the Trust's own vault manager had spent 18 years making sure nobody could prove. Garrett Renner had managed the Ashgrove Trust's precious metals vault since 2006, and had run it by every account in town with a reputation nobody had ever thought to question. The gymnasium had been strung with white lights for the occasion, folding tables draped in linen along the walls, a string quartet from the county college working through something quiet near the punch bowl. I had come early, before the doors opened to guests, to make sure the old scale would hold up under the evening's centerpiece moment, tightening a spring that had gone loose sometime over the winter and testing the balance against a set of calibration weights I kept in my truck for exactly this kind of job. I was still kneeling by the display table adjusting the scale's calibration screw when the doors opened and the room began to fill, and Renner, who had arrived early himself to oversee the bar's placement, picked it up off its velvet stand and held it out toward the small crowd gathered for the unveiling, already smiling in a way that told me he had planned this next part before I ever walked in the door. "Since we have a repairman here," he said, loud enough for the room, "let's put his hands to a real test." He set the bar on my freshly calibrated scale and gave me the same challenge he had already given the whole room, word for word, the sneer already fixed on his face before I answered a single thing. That was the exchange the whole room remembers, and it is the only part of that night I have already told you. I understood only much later why that particular bar had been the one sitting on the velvet stand. It was the first bar the family had ever bought, back in 1979, the one with the best story attached to it, the one Garrett always introduced by name at events like this one. The best story made it the safest bar to swap, since nobody who trusted that story would ever think to doubt the object underneath it. I understood something else later, too. A room full of donors watching a scale settle dead on the mark was worth 10 years of quiet provenance, renewed free of charge every single time he staged it. He had run that little ceremony before, at other galas, with other scales. He was not worried about a repairman reading a needle. He thought I was there to be the finale, not the complication. What the room did not see afterward was Gideon Ashgrove, 70 years old and leaning slightly on a cane he pretended he did not need, watching the way Renner's face had tightened for exactly 1 second before he smoothed it back into a smile. He waited until most of the guests had drifted toward the dessert table before he crossed the gymnasium floor to where I was still packing up my tools, and told me plainly that he had chaired this trust since his father died in 2010, and that whatever he had just watched cross Garrett's face was going to keep him awake that night whether he wanted it to or not. "Garrett has managed that vault since before I took the chair," Gideon said. I would like to believe what just happened here was nothing. He studied me. Would you take a proper look if I asked you to? I told him I would, not because I already suspected anything, but because a man does not offer to hand his family's oldest secret to a repairman unless some part of him already suspects it himself. Gideon told me a little more that night than he probably meant to. His father had bought the 12 bars in 1979, not as an investment exactly, more as a hedge against a decade that had scared a lot of careful men into distrusting paper money altogether. They had sat in a private vault ever since, mostly unremarked upon, brought out for polite mention at exactly this kind of event once every few years, and otherwise left alone to simply exist as proof that the family kept its promises. My father trusted very few people with very much, Gideon said. Garrett was one of perhaps 3 men he ever trusted with everything. 3 nights later, after Sawyer was asleep, I finally opened my grandfather's box all the way. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time before I even lifted the lid, the same table where Renata used to grade papers with a cup of tea going cold beside her. I thought about how easy it would be to put the whole thing back on the shelf and tell Gideon I had looked and found nothing worth mentioning. I did not do that. I lifted the balance out first, then the calipers, then the steel rod, setting each one down in the exact order my grandfather always kept them, and only then did I reach past them. Down to a composition notebook at the bottom I had never once looked inside. Every page was numbers and initials in his cramped hand, decades of coins and rings and small ingots he had authenticated for people across 3 counties. On a page dated 1979, I found 12 entries in a single afternoon, each one marked with a weight, a set of dimensions, and a small pencil rubbing of a Hallmark stamp. Ashgrove Family Trust, the header read, 12 bars purchased as a hedge, authenticated on site. A folded scrap of paper had been tucked behind that page in my grandfather's own hand, words he must have written for no one but himself. So no one can ever tell a man what he's holding isn't real, it read, when it plainly is. I sat with that scrap of paper longer than I meant to. I understood, reading it, that I had spent 4 years avoiding this box for reasons that had very little to do with tools, and that some part of me had known exactly what I would find once I finally let myself look. Grief, it turns out, is not always about the person you lost. Sometimes it is about every ordinary thing that person would have wanted you to keep doing and did not get the chance to remind you of. I called Gideon the next morning and asked whether the trust would let me examine the Gala bar properly, under better light and with better tools than a folding table at a fundraiser. He met me himself at a small side office off the Historical Society's archive room. No crowd this time. Just the 2 of us in the bar, sitting on a square of black felt. The bar had passed my scale at the gala with the correct weight to 2 decimal places, which never surprised me. Tungsten sits close enough to gold in density that weight alone was never going to catch anything, and I understood, sitting there, exactly why whoever did this had felt safe relying on it for so long. What it had not done was answer when I tapped it. And gold. Real gold always does. Now, with better light, and my grandfather's own hallmark rubbing from 1979 laid flat beside the bar, I could see what a glance at the gala never would have shown me. Same design pressed into the metal, different depth, a slightly different hand guiding the strike. Somebody had re-stamped that mark, carefully, but not carefully enough to fool the man who took the first rubbing. I did not know yet how many of the 12 bars carried that same quiet difference. I only knew that whoever had made it happen had access nobody else in that vault had ever been given. I did not sleep well that night, turning the problem over the way you turn a stubborn bolt, a 1/4 inch at a time, until it finally gives. By morning, the whole mechanism sat in front of me, clear enough that I almost wished it did not. A bar gets pulled from the vault during a routine reappraisal, quietly swapped for a tungsten core, dressed in enough real gold plating to pass a casual glance and a quick weigh-in. The paperwork gets updated to reflect nothing more than an ordinary annual inspection. The genuine bar moves out through a broker who asks no questions about where a small, unmarked gold ingot actually came from, sold off cheap enough that nobody downstream has any reason to look closer, cleaned up over time and eventually resold at its true value to a buyer who never thinks to ask why an estate liquidation left no further provenance behind it at all. The trust's insurance rider, which Gideon later shared with me himself once he understood what I was asking, required a full physical inspection of the collection once a year, timed to a designated week each spring, and required that inspection to be conducted solely by the vault's appointed custodian for security reasons written into the policy itself. Since 2012, when the vault's security had been upgraded and that rider first took effect, Garrett Renner had been the only person in that building holding a key during that week, every single year, 12 years running. That was the window. I did not yet have proof of what had passed through it, only the shape of an opportunity that had existed for exactly as long as somebody patient enough might have needed to use it. One more thing surfaced that same evening, small enough that I almost missed it. Tucked behind the 1979 page in my grandfather's notebook was a later entry dated 2005, the year he died, a single line noting that he had given a personal reference for a younger man in the regional coin trade applying for a position managing a private collection. He had not written the man's name in full, only initials. GR. I sat with that for a long while, turning it over, trying to decide whether it changed anything about what I already knew. It changed everything and nothing at once. My own grandfather had vouched for the man who would spend the next 12 years quietly proving that vouching for someone is never the same as knowing what they will do once nobody else is watching. Tracking down Priscilla Nash took most of a week. She had worked as the trust's administrative assistant for 9 years before quitting abruptly 6 years ago. And the only lead I had was a name a librarian at the county archive mentioned in passing when I asked who else might remember the office from that era. When I finally reached her by phone, she was careful, guarded, and clearly still angry about something she had never had the chance to say out loud to anyone who mattered. "I logged every visitor to that building for 9 years, she said. Reappraisal week was the 1 week a year. Garrett didn't want me anywhere near the vault floor. Told me it was insurance policy, nothing personal. I believed him for the first 6 years, mostly because he was never anything but polite about it, and polite men rarely get questioned twice in a town like this one. What changed? The 7th year, I forgot my umbrella and came back for it after hours, she said. He was down there alone with a courier van parked outside that didn't belong to any appraisal firm I recognized. When he saw me, he told me the driver was lost and asking directions. I wanted to believe that too. I let the silence sit a moment before I asked the question I had actually called to ask. Did you ever tell anyone what you saw? I tried. Once, right after it happened, she said. Told the board chair at the time, Gideon's predecessor, an old friend of Garrett's from way back. He told me couriers make mistakes with directions all the time and suggested I focus on my actual job. I took the hint. Why are you telling me this now? I asked, when you wouldn't say a word for 6 years. Because 6 years ago nobody would have believed me either, she said. I was the assistant who got let go over a filing dispute. According to the official version, nobody believes an assistant with a grudge. Maybe they'll believe a man whose scale doesn't lie. She had not seen enough to prove anything, and she told me so herself, plainly, without trying to dress it up as more than it was. But she remembered the name stenciled on the side of that van, faint under a fresh coat of paint. The state's registry of licensed precious metals dealers was not something a person could simply search from a phone at the kitchen table. Gideon's attorney was the one who finally pulled it. Through a request tied to the trust's own active fraud complaint, the kind of law originally written to keep stolen jewelry and bullion from moving quietly through pawn shops without a paper trail. Buried in that registry was a shell company filed under the same name Priscilla remembered from the van, registered to an address that traced back 3 steps later to Garrett Renner's own brother-in-law. The filings showed 5 separate transactions over 11 years, each one logged as an estate liquidation with no further provenance available, each one selling a single gold bar at a price that made sense only if the seller had bought it for almost nothing. 5 sales, 4 bars still unaccounted for beyond the one I was already holding proof against. Tomorrow, I would have to stand in front of a man I had never once spoken to about any of this, and tell him I believed he had spent over a decade quietly hollowing out a family's trust 1 bar at a time, without knowing yet whether anyone besides Gideon would believe a repairman over an 18-year custodian. Looking back, this is the part of the story where I stopped being the careful man my grandfather raised. I sat in my truck outside the Historical Society building for the better part of an hour before I made the decision, telling myself every reason it was a bad idea and then talking myself out of every single one of them in turn. Millhaven's community center, which shared its old maintenance systems with the Historical Society building next door, still had me listed in its service records from a boiler repair job 3 years back, and the access code for the after-hours utility door had never once been changed. I told myself I only wanted 5 minutes alone with the other 11 bars, enough to tap each one and know for certain how many still answered and how many stayed silent. I let myself in a little after midnight. The display cases had been pulled out for cleaning ahead of the gallery's renovation, and the whole collection sat exposed on felt-lined trays behind a low cordon rope, waiting to be reset once the new glass arrived. I never touched a single tray, never lifted a bar off its cloth. I only leaned over the cordon and touched each one with the tip of my grandfather's rod once, low near the corner, and listened. My own pulse was loud enough in my ears that I nearly missed the first answer, a bar 3 trays down that rang clean and long, and I had to stand still a moment and let my breathing settle before I trusted my own ear again. 4 more bars stayed silent. 7 rang the way gold is supposed to ring. I never crossed the cordon. It did not matter. The corridor camera outside the vault room, the one nobody had told me still worked during the renovation, caught every minute of it in clear color, time-stamped, undeniable. Gideon called me himself the next morning, his voice careful in a way that told me, before his words did, that something had already gone wrong. Garrett had reviewed the footage first thing, he said, and had already drafted a formal notice barring me from the property, citing an unauthorized after-hours entry into a secured vault area. The board would meet within the week to decide whether to involve the police. "I am not defending what he might have done," Gideon said, "but I cannot defend what you did last night either." He was right, and knowing he was right did not make the next 2 weeks any easier. Renner used my own trespassing to paint the entire accusation as the invention of a man with something to prove, a repairman who had let himself into a vault at midnight and then dared to accuse the person who managed it honestly. He was careful about it, too, never raising his voice, only ever expressing a kind of weary patience for a grieving man who had let his imagination run past what the evidence could actually support. It was, I had to admit, a more effective performance than outright anger would have been. The board suspended my access to the collection and to Gideon himself pending review. Word moved through Millhaven the way it always does in a town this size, and I noticed a few regulars at the shop start asking after my work in a tone that was not quite the same as before. Those evenings, Sawyer and I sat at the kitchen table together the way we usually did, him bent over spelling words, me trying to explain in terms an 8-year-old could actually hold on to why sneaking into a building in the middle of the night had left me looking, on paper, almost exactly like the kind of man I was trying to warn everyone about. "You didn't take anything," Sawyer said, pencil still moving across his list. "You just listened." "I still wasn't supposed to be there," I said. "That's different from stealing, though," he said, frowning at his own math problem like it might hold the answer to this one, too. "Isn't it?" "It is," I admitted. "It's still going to cost us something. Being right about a thing doesn't always mean you get to skip paying for how you found out." He thought about that, tapped his pencil twice against the table the way he taps everything, and returned to his spelling list without pressing the point further, the same steady focus he brought to every problem that had a real answer waiting somewhere underneath it. I had no idea yet how much that particular habit of his was about to matter. It was my own grandfather's notebook, sitting exactly where it had sat for weeks, that reminded me I still had something Renner could not touch and had never known existed. He had authenticated those 12 bars in 1979 in his own shop, decades before the trust ever built a vault to keep them in, and the record of that day belonged to my family, not the Ashgroves, not the board, and certainly not Renner. I called Gideon and asked for one thing only, a chance to lay my grandfather's original 1979 notes beside the trust's own insurance rider and the state's dealer registry in front of the full board before any decision about the police was made final. He agreed, over what I later learned was loud objection from Renner himself. The board met that Thursday evening in the Historical Society's small conference room, 5 trustees around an old oak table, Gideon at the head, Renner seated across from an empty chair that had clearly been left for me. Rain had started sometime during the drive over, and it kept tapping against the window the whole meeting, a sound I could not stop noticing once I had started listening for it. He had brought a folder of his own, thick and organized, and he opened the meeting before anyone else had a chance to. "I want to be direct with this board," he said, calm and measured, the same voice I imagine he had used for 18 years to make people believe whatever he needed them to believe. "A man broke into a secured vault at midnight. He now claims the collection I have protected for nearly 2 decades is not what it appears to be. I would ask this board to consider which of those 2 facts is easier to prove." 2 of the 4 other trustees were nodding along by the time he finished speaking. Gideon sat with his hands folded, saying nothing yet. "The unauthorized entry is not in dispute," Renner went on. "What is in dispute is whether this board wants to take the word of a man with a criminal exposure over the word of a custodian with 18 years of documented audited service to this family." He set his folder down flat. "I understand grief does strange things to a person's judgment. I do not believe Mr. Calloway is malicious. I believe he is mistaken, and I believe this board owes itself better evidence than a repairman's ear before it destroys a career built over 2 decades. One of the trustees, a retired school teacher named Marjorie, who had known Renner socially for years, said quietly that she found it hard to imagine him doing something like this, and that she would need very strong evidence before she voted to end a career on suspicion alone. Another trustee, younger, glanced at his watch and suggested they simply table the whole matter until the financial audit already scheduled for the following quarter, a suggestion that would have given Renner months of uninterrupted access to finish covering whatever remained uncovered. Every eye at that table had drifted toward Renner, or toward the door, or toward the clock ticking behind Gideon's chair. Mine was the only face nobody in the room seemed interested in reading. I laid my grandfather's notebook open on the table, turned to the 1979 page. Beside it, the trust's own insurance rider showing Renner's sole access every reappraisal week since 2012, and beside that, the state dealer registry filing traced to his brother-in-law's shell company. "This is not my word against his," I said. "This is a private record my grandfather kept 45 years before any of us sat in this room, next to your own trust's insurance paperwork, next to a public filing with the state. None of those 3 things needed me to say anything at all." Something shifted in Renner's posture, small but unmistakable, a straightening of the spine that looked less like confidence than like a man bracing for impact. "Coincidence," he said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned. "My brother-in-law runs a legitimate metals business. I have never once directed a sale through him." The room stayed quiet long enough for the rain against the window to feel loud again. "Then explain the timing," Gideon said, and it was the first time he had spoken since the meeting began. He set his own folder down beside mine, papers he had pulled himself from the trust's archive that same afternoon. "Every one of these 5 sales happened during the exact week each year. You told this board you needed the vault to yourself for insurance reasons. I checked the dates against your own signed access logs before I walked into this room tonight." Renner had no answer ready for that, and the silence that followed it lasted long enough that I heard the old clock on the wall tick 3 full times. "Nobody at this table has to trust either of us," Gideon said, closing his folder as though the matter were already settled. "A notebook older than this vault says what my father actually bought. Your own signed log says exactly when you were the only man alive who could touch it. A filing with the state says where it went after. Put those 3 next to each other, and there isn't much left worth arguing about." Marjorie, the trustee who had spoken up for him minutes earlier, did not look at him again after that. Whatever she had decided to believe about 18 years of easy familiarity, it did not survive the sight of him bracing like a man expecting to be struck. Renner looked once around the table, at faces that had started the evening nodding along with him, and now would not quite meet his eyes, and offered no confession and no further denial. Only a flat statement that he would cooperate fully with whatever review the board deemed appropriate before he gathered his folder and left the room without waiting to be excused. Walking out of that meeting, I let myself believe the hardest part was over. 4 days passed before I found out exactly how mistaken that was, and this time the trouble had nothing to do with vaults or boards at all. Sawyer's school called me at the shop, the office manager's voice tight with a concern she could not quite explain. A package addressed to Sawyer had arrived that morning, no return address, containing a cheap plastic toy and a small card with no name on it. The card read, in typed block letters, Room 14, Locker 62, and underneath that, 2 dots drawn side by side. Nothing else. No words to explain them. Anyone could have seen him do it. That was what made it worse, not better. Sawyer taps everything twice before he trusts it, in the open, at school, at the grocery store, anywhere. His hands land on something new, and somebody had watched him do it long enough, closely enough, to know exactly what those 2 dots would mean to the one family who would recognize them. I sat in the school parking lot a long while after that call, hands too unsteady to trust behind a wheel yet. When Sawyer climbed into the truck, backpack thumping the seat, and asked why I looked strange, I told him I was just tired. He shrugged and started talking about recess before I even finished the sentence, and I let him, grateful for once that an 8-year-old's attention moves on so quickly. That night, once he was finally asleep, I sat in the kitchen with the card in front of me under the lamp, staring at those 2 dots like they might rearrange themselves into something less frightening if I looked long enough. I thought about Renata, about the particular kind of fear that comes from realizing you are the only thing standing between your child and a danger you cannot fully name. I did not sleep much. I checked the lock on the front door twice, which we never do in Millhaven, and stood in Sawyer's doorway a long while just listening to him breathe. I brought the card straight to Gideon, then to the trust's attorney, then, within 2 days, to the county's financial crimes unit, along with the minutes from Thursday's meeting and every detail Priscilla had shared with me. An investigator there explained plainly that a card like that was not evidence of a crime in itself, but that combined with everything else, it was exactly the kind of pressure a man uses when he has run out of other ways to make a problem go away quietly. I understood the timing of it better once the investigator laid it out. The unit still needed one thing to close its file for good, a formal deposition where I walked them through the tap test on the record, sworn, with my grandfather's rod in hand. Garrett was not trying to win the vault back with that card. He was trying to make sure the man who could make a bar answer or stay silent never showed up to say so under oath. The school agreed, at my request, to flag Sawyer's pickup list and keep an extra staff member near the front office during dismissal. For the rest of that semester, a small, quiet accommodation nobody made a fuss over. Sawyer noticed anyway, the way kids notice everything adults try to keep from them, and asked me once, very directly, whether someone was trying to hurt him. I told him no, that someone was trying to scare me, and that being scared for a little while was a much smaller thing than being hurt. He seemed to accept that, mostly, though he started tapping door frames on his way into school each morning twice, the same as everything else he wanted to trust. What followed took months, not days, and none of it happened the way it does in the stories people tell each other about justice arriving fast. The state board that licensed precious metals dealers opened a formal review into Renner's brother-in-law's company, and within that review, into Renner's own conduct as a fiduciary. His authority over the vault was suspended immediately and never restored. The Financial Crimes Unit built its case slowly, methodically, the way real cases get built, matching invoices and access logs and bank transfers that took weeks to fully trace. I kept working through most of it, fixing vending machines and arcade cabinets same as always, because a route does not run itself, and Sawyer still needed dinner on the table every night regardless of what was happening at the courthouse. Customers asked after the case sometimes, having read a small item in the local paper about an ongoing investigation into the trust's holdings, and I told most of them honestly that I did not know much more than they did, which for long stretches of that winter was simply true. There was no arrest made in front of a crowd, no photograph above the fold in the local paper, no moment anyone could point to later and call the ending. It resolved itself the unglamorous way most real fraud cases do, buried in filings and hearing dates, each one closing off a little more room for doubt until there was simply none left standing. Priscilla told me later that she had finally been asked to give a formal statement to the Financial Crimes Unit, something she said she had wanted for 6 years, without ever expecting it would actually happen after so long being told, politely, to let the matter rest. Gideon offered to have the trust cover any legal costs she incurred cooperating, which she declined, telling him she had not come forward for money and did not intend to start needing it now, 6 years of silence being payment enough for one lifetime. Of the 5 bars confirmed missing, 3 were eventually recovered from buyers willing to return them once they understood what they had actually purchased, each one arriving back at the trust through a courier service rather than any dramatic reveal, boxed up and shipped like any other piece of ordinary business. The other 2 remained open questions, the kind of loose thread Gideon told me he had made peace with, never fully closing. Because peace, he said, does not always require every last answer. Gideon told me once, over coffee in his study, a few weeks after the board meeting, that his late wife had always kept better track of people than he had, that she used to warn him gently about trusting a man's manner instead of his record. She had passed 11 years earlier, and he admitted, quietly, that some part of him had let his guard down with Renner precisely because the man had never once made him feel the way careless people usually do. That, he said, was the part that unsettled him most. Not that Renner had lied well, but that he had lied so patiently for so long that patience itself had started to look like proof of honesty. "I keep asking myself what she would have noticed that I didn't," he said, turning his coffee cup slowly on its saucer. "I think the honest answer is that she would have wanted to hear him answer a hard question, the way you made him do at that meeting, instead of simply trusting how he carried himself in easy ones." The Millhaven County Historical Society held a small private reception that winter to formally close out the gala's matching pledge. Only a handful of people this time. No crowd, no scale set up for spectacle. Gideon asked me and Sawyer to come. I almost said no. Some part of me still expected to walk into that building and feel the same weight I had felt walking out of the board meeting, the sense of being tolerated rather than believed. Sawyer talked me into it in the end, mostly by asking whether there would be the good little sandwiches they always had at these things. And I decided a boy who could still think about sandwiches after everything the last few months had put him through deserved to go somewhere nice for an evening. Marjorie, the trustee who had doubted me at the board meeting, found me near the coat rack and apologized without being asked to, admitting she had let 18 years of easy familiarity stand in for evidence she should have demanded from the start. I told her most people would have done the same. She said that was generous of me. I told her it was just true. Priscilla came too, at Gideon's invitation, standing a little apart from the crowd in a plain gray dress, looking like a woman who had spent 6 years rehearsing how she would feel the day something finally proved her right and had not expected it to feel quite this quiet. Gideon crossed the room to thank her personally, and I watched her accept it the way a person accepts something they have wanted for a long time and almost stopped believing would come. He had brought one of the 7 confirmed genuine bars from the collection, and instead of setting it on the Historical Society's ceremonial scale, he carried it over to the folding table where I had set my grandfather's wooden box and placed it carefully on my grandfather's own brass balance. "I would like your opinion," he said, "on whether this one is real." Sawyer, without being asked, stepped forward first, tapped the bar twice with one fingernail the way he taps everything he wants to trust, and grinned so wide I thought his face might not hold it. "It answered," he said. "It did," I said. "It always was going to." Gideon smiled, an expression with none of the caution left in it that 18 years of trusting the wrong man had cost him. "If it's real, it answers you back," he said, testing the words like he was trying them on for the first time. "That's what my grandfather used to say," I told him. "He meant it about metal first. I think he meant it about people too eventually. I know I do now." "Then I suppose I owe your grandfather a debt he'll never collect on," Gideon said. "So I'll settle it with his grandson instead." He nodded toward the wooden box on the table between us. "That thing has done more for this family than 18 years of paperwork ever did." That evening, after the reception, I set my grandfather's box on our own kitchen table and showed Sawyer, properly this time, how to use the balance and the calipers, how to hold the steel rod loose in his fingers so the tap came out clean instead of forced. He asked whether he could keep one of Silas's old test coins in his room the way some kids keep a favorite rock or a lucky coin from an arcade machine, and I told him yes, as long as he understood it was not a toy, that it had belonged to a man who took it seriously enough to teach 2 generations after him how to listen properly. "Is that why you never opened the box?" he asked, not looking up from the calipers he was turning over in his hands. "Because it was serious?" I had not expected the question. Did not have a smooth answer ready for it. "Something like that," I said. "I think I was scared of what it would remind me of." "Mom?" "Mom," I said, "and Grandpa Silas, sometimes it's easier to just not look at a thing than to look at it and remember everything it stands for." He nodded slowly, the way a kid nods when he has decided an answer is good enough, even if he does not fully understand it yet, and went back to fitting the calipers around the edge of the coin. "Will you teach me the tap thing properly?" he asked. "Not just the 2 knocks I already do, the real one with the rod, like at the gala." "When you're a little older," I said, "it takes a careful hand. You have to know exactly how hard to strike it, or you get a false answer either way, too soft to hear right or hard enough to chip something that never deserved chipping. How did you know how hard that night? 30 years of practice, I said, and a lot of coins I got wrong before I ever got one right. He seemed satisfied with that, the way kids usually are with an honest answer, even when it is not the exciting one they were hoping for, and went quiet again, turning the old coin over and over between his fingers, listening, I think, for something even he could not yet name. If it's real, it answers you back, I told him, setting his hand flat over mine on the small scale between us. That goes for coins. It goes for people too, when you give them the chance to. You do not have to understand every part of that today. Just keep listening for it. He tapped the edge of the scale itself, twice, out of habit, and laughed when it made no sound at all worth mentioning, then looked up at me like he had already understood something I had spent most of my adult life avoiding. I did not try to explain it further than that. Some lessons are better left to arrive on their own schedule, the same slow way mine had. Some evenings now, once the shop is locked up and the house has gone quiet around a sleeping 8-year-old, I take the box down from its shelf, just to run my thumb along the grain of the wood my grandfather sanded smooth 50 years before I was born. I keep it on the kitchen shelf these days, instead of the back of the shop, close enough that Sawyer can reach it himself if he wants to, which was never something I would have allowed a year ago. Nobody ever paid my grandfather to keep his records that carefully. He did it because a shortcut, even a small one, was the kind of debt that eventually came due on somebody else's account instead of his own, and he refused to leave that bill for a stranger to pay. Gold does not need a witness to be real. People, it turns out, sometimes do. And for 40 years, my grandfather was willing to be that witness for anyone who walked through his door. I do not know that I will ever match that. I know I can keep trying, one honest measurement at a time, and teach my son to listen for the difference between something that answers and something that only pretends to.